So welcome to what is now the 23rd seminar for 2021 in the Society for Conservation Biology's Emerging Issues in Conservation seminar series. In this series, we feature articles selected by the editors that are currently accepted in early online view or recently published in the 3 SEB journals, those being Conservation Biology, Conservation Letters, and of course, Conservation Science and Practice. My name is Martin Strauss, and I'll be hosting the seminar today. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Environmental Sciences at the University of South Africa, and I'm also an associate editor at Conservation Science and Practice, and it is in that capacity that I've been organizing the seminar series this year. So it is my great pleasure to introduce you today to Drs. Simon Coghlan and Adam Cardilini. So Simon is a philosopher and veterinarian with interests in animal ethics and environmental ethics. He's currently a research fellow at the University of Melbourne, where he's researching digital and AI ethics, including the uses of technologies for animals and the environment. Adam is an environmental scientist at Deakin University in Australia and works on questions related to ecology, conservation, and society. He has experience in evolutionary ecological genomics, urban ecology, and non-native species ecology. Adam is interested in how concern for animals informs environmental values and practice, and how we can take more critical approaches to how the sciences consider animals. Adam's research is focused on helping to create a better future for animals, the environment, and animals, and humans, pardon. So Adam and Simon, with that, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Martin. Really appreciate it. And thanks for inviting us here to give the presentation. And I just want to give a shout out. I've noticed in the chat, Amy is from LA and it's 1 a.m. Thanks so much for joining us, Amy. That's impressive. And to all the colleagues from around the world, thanks for jumping on. I suppose I just want to start with a little bit of context about why we've written this paper, why we did this review. And it started a couple of years ago when Simon and I were discussing some of the literature coming out around compassionate conservation and a workshop that we ran to have discussions on wildlife ethics and how we engage with animals and animal ethics in conservation. And after reading some of the articles that were coming out, we felt like the conversation from both proponents of compassionate conservation and critics, it seemed like the argument was sort of being had over one another rather than with one another. They weren't necessarily speaking or discussing together, but rather speaking at odds. We wanted to dig into the conversation and see which arguments held weight and which ones didn't, and identify which of the issues that could be profitably brought to the forefront and discussed to progress the discussion, rather than have the discussion sort of stagnate, which I think it sort of has been for a little while. So what we did was we started by reviewing the literature on compassionate conservation, did literature searches and basically read every article that had compassionate conservation, either in the title or in the abstract or somewhere in the piece. And particularly those that were identifying those ones which were advocating for a compassionate conservation approach. And we found around about just over 40 publications that were in this realm. And through a deep reading of all of those, we sort of gathered some of the history of the compassionate conservation sort of movement, where it's come from and why it's happening. And we also identified a series of, or a set of foundational beliefs that we think can be found within the literature. And Simon will argue that we think that that compassionate conservation exists in this bounded pluralism. So it has been presented in criticisms with a particular as being coming from a particular set of values, but we think that it's wider than that, and it's broader than that, and broader than perhaps it's being presented as at the moment. So we'll go over these things first to give you a understanding, or from what we've understood of compassionate conservation, and then we'll get into the criticisms that have been levelled at compassionate conservation and how we've responded to those. Right. So a brief history of why is compassionate conservation a thing? Why are people presenting it as an alternative or a new way of thinking about how we should approach conservation? It all starts, there's been a very long history of consideration of animal ethics in philosophy and philosophical thought for centuries, millennia, and in the mid 20th century, we start to have more specific conversations around this. And one example is Singer, but Singer's not the only example. There's also Reagan and other scholars who sort of brought the conversation about how we treat animals to the forefront. And this was being had at the same time as we were discussing things around how we engage with the environment and nature and our duties to both nature and animals. In 1985, Soule wrote the seminal piece on conservation, called What is Conservation Biology, and sort of laid out a description of what they thought conservation biology was, what it was concerned with, and what it should do. And in that, Soule explicitly says that conservation biology and animal welfare should be separate, that we shouldn't be concerning ourselves with animal welfare, and it shouldn't be sort of necessarily informing what we do in conservation, because there's hard decisions to be made, basically. A big call, but it sort of was the foundation of much of what we might consider as conservation today, those thoughts that Soule laid out. In the 90s and 2000s, we are continuing to have these really vigorous debates about animals' place in the world and how we should engage with them, and our moral responsibilities and ethical responsibilities to them. Mary Midgley is a good example of some good writing in this space, and asking us to care more for others, not just humans. And then, so these debates are ongoing and occurring throughout these decades. Then we get to 2008, where a workshop is held at the University of British Columbia at an animal welfare institution, and it's bringing together animal welfare scientists and conservationists. And it sort of spurs on this the subdisciplines that we now think of as compassionate conservation, conservation welfare, and wildlife welfare. And from that workshop, we start to see the publication of work on the ideas explicitly of compassionate conservation and conservation welfare. In 2012, we get the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness. And this is just to highlight that alongside all of these conversations around ethics and conservation and wildlife welfare, our understanding of animals through science and ethology and behavioral ecology and all of these other types of sciences, we are getting a much better understanding of animals, to the point where we're confident to say that yes, most or many animals, certainly mammals, birds, and many others, are conscious and have these deep, rich lives, which I think again was a trigger for the people who were already considering and thinking about this sort of stuff to sort of double down and go, yeah, well, why are we separating animal welfare from our discussions of conservation? Why aren't we including it? Because a lot of our conservation practices do have serious implications for animals and cause significant harm to many animals across the world. So compassionate conservation is sort of bringing animals back into the conversation about conservation, where it was split in 1985. So we're a few decades down the road, and there's been some tradition built into the conservation practice that sort of is pushing back against that idea of including animal welfare, but compassionate conservation is trying to bring it back in. And in 2018, in 2015, there's the articulation of the 4 guiding principles of compassionate conservation, which are really heavily related to how we should consider animals in conservation. We get an article by Wallach and others called Summoning Compassion to Address the Challenges of Conservation in 2018. And that kicks off this really strong sort of discussion that then has been occurring over the last sort of 5 years between proponents of compassionate conservation and critics. And we go from that point, that the paper that Ariane Wallach and colleagues wrote, and wanted to dig into the criticisms of that work and by proxy, the criticisms of compassionate conservation in particular. And that gets us to today, where we're discussing these issues. So when we look into what actually compassionate conservation is, when we read through those 40 papers, 40 plus papers, we actually find much greater diversity of beliefs and foundational beliefs than is presented or assumed by critics in particular. So critics focus on these 4 guiding principles: first, do no harm; individuals matter; peaceful coexistence; and inclusivity. And maybe that's because they are so different to perhaps what was previously suggested, or it's quite a challenge to the norms of conservation. And they bring back into the fold this idea of valuing animals and considering animals in our conservation. But it's not all that compassionate conservation is about. Compassionate conservation also holds values related to conservation, and these include, caring about conservation, caring about collectives, and believing that collectives are worthy of protection and have intrinsic value. Something that critics have criticised compassionate conservation for, or have said that they don't hold, beliefs that they don't hold. They also have other values around conservation. Similarly, they have certain beliefs around science and conservation practice. And that's that we should be bringing in these other ideas, this other field of science that's been working parallel to conservation for many decades around animal behaviour and our understanding of animals. And that should now be informing both our approach to ethics of animals, how we engage with animals and work with animals in conservation, and how we think about the science that we do on animals, and that we can no longer just ignore the ideas of, or we can no longer ignore sort of animals as this animal welfare as this thing that doesn't really belong in the conversation for conservation, as well as other sort of foundational beliefs. You can read them here. So compassionate conservation is more than just these 4 foundational beliefs. It's this wider sort of set of ideas that make up who a compassionate conservation might be. And now Simon's going to chat about the bounded pluralism of compassionate conservation.
Thank you very much, Adam, and welcome to everyone. It's great to see you all here. I think our mission should be to keep Amy awake in Los Angeles so she doesn't go to sleep, being 1 a.m. over there. Let's see how we go. Good luck to us. So taking off from where Adam just finished there, we talked about the foundational beliefs, the sort of core beliefs or necessary beliefs that make somebody a compassionate conservationist. But looking through the critiques of compassionate conservation, we noticed that that sometimes they didn't fully recognise, or sometimes didn't recognise at all, that a compassionate conservationist can also, or compassionate conservationists can also disagree with one another on certain matters, while still remaining, thanks Amy, still remaining compassionate conservationists. So we talk about, in the paper, we talk about a bounded pluralism. So the bounded bit means that there are some essential features to compassionate conservation that make it what it is, and that it cannot do without. But also it has the potential for pluralism. So that is, compassionate conservationists might have different, sometimes even conflicting beliefs and values that they bring to this, this conversation. So just to give you some examples of potentially divergent beliefs and values amongst compassionate conservationists, one of those would be that that they could disagree on the precise moral value of animals and the animals to which compassion is due. In particular, whether compassion and moral respect, moral consideration should be extended beyond sentient animals to non-sentient individuals or organisms. So that's one of the ways in which they could potentially disagree. Nonetheless, it seems to be the case that compassionate conservation is very much interested in sentience, in sentient individuals, and according those individuals a significant moral value. So compassionate conservationists could also disagree on the question as to whether humans and other non-human organisms or individuals are moral equals. So some compassionate conservationists might think that is potentially the case. Others may disagree. Some compassionate conservationists think that non-human animals should be called persons or recognized as ethical persons. Others may potentially disagree with that. A third area in which they might disagree with one another, while still remaining compassionate conservationists, is in terms of the threshold which they recognize for harming or killing sentient animals. Now, some compassionate conservationists, in fact, some of the more prominent compassionate conservationists think that we should never do so, that we should never deliberately or intentionally harm or kill a sentient individual, because that is wrong. There are others, though, within the compassionate conservation fold that that say, or could say, that perhaps harming and killing, deliberate harming and killing, is sometimes justifiable, perhaps in very extreme circumstances or last resort kind of conditions. And the final area of potential difference and divergence amongst compassionate conservationists that we'd want to point out is that they could disagree with one another on which moral theories should underpin their moral beliefs about animals and humans and the natural world. So some compassionate conservationists have identified themselves more or less as virtue ethicists, as agreeing with kind of a virtue theory perspective on morality. Others might identify more strongly with deontology, the idea that morality is essentially a system of rules. Others might come from very different perspectives, say eco-feminist perspectives. There seems to be a tendency for critics of compassionate conservation to think that, or at least that one gets this sense from reading the literature that that a compassionate conservationist can't be a consequentialist, for example, a utilitarian. We'd want to question that. I don't think that has been demonstrated at this point. I think that it seems to us possible that a compassionate conservationist could become or be a consequentialist, that is someone who thinks that what is right and wrong is determined entirely by the consequences of our actions and by nothing else. So there's a brief indication of the degree, a certain degree of pluralism, divergence, diversity amongst compassionate conservationists while remaining committed to certain core foundational values. Now, I'll just throw it back to you, Adam, I think, for the next slide.
Yeah, so now we'll get into sort of the criticisms of compassionate conservation, and to evaluate or to work through and analyse the criticisms of compassionate conservation, we reviewed 11 publications that specifically sort of wrote a critique of either Wallach's article 2018, or subsequently were part of that debate that was going on in the last sort of 4 to 5 years. And we extracted 117 quotes that we then identified specific criticism for, and of those, we found that there were sort of these 4 themes of criticism. There's actually 5, but the 5th theme was so sort of baseless that we haven't included it. You can read it in the table, but the arguments are pretty lackluster there. The criticisms are pretty lackluster. But the ones that sort of we identified were criticisms of the ethical foundations of compassionate conservation, criticisms of the definition of compassionate, and that was one that came up time and time again. Criticisms of the scientific credentials of compassionate conservation, and then finally criticisms around the how compassionate conservation seems to be unclear in how it would actually be applied in a conservation setting or in conservation practice. And we identified in the ones that are blue, or the one, so a series of criticisms that we wanted to respond to. They warranted examination or clarification because they reoccurred so often. They were sort of trundled out by many of the critiques, so they required a response. But even so, many of these were either question-begging, confused, or overlooked conceptual complexity. They didn't really dig into the detail or necessarily understand what the compassionate conservationists were necessarily saying. Some of them were also in the literature, and it just seemed like they hadn't read what the compassionate conservationists had written. So, for instance, clarifications on the application of compassionate conservation. There were several criticisms that if the people criticising, or the authors, had read some of the literature of compassionate conservation, they would have been able to answer those questions. There are also, the ones in red, there were also several critiques that just didn't warrant any response because they were not necessarily very good critiques. And I'll pass it over to Simon to work through some of these criticisms.
Okay, thanks, Adam. So what we'll do now is take you through some of the criticisms we encountered of compassionate conservation, and draw out perhaps some of their weaknesses. But then we want to have a look at some questions that perhaps the compassionate conservationists themselves could address more fully, or it would certainly be profitable for them to explore in more depth, perhaps with the aim of clarification, but also perhaps with the aim of deepening the conversation and moving it forward. So let's start off with this one here. There is a critique that concerns one of the core features of compassionate conservation, and that is compassion itself. And so how do critics then understand compassion versus people who identify as compassionate conservationists? So let's look at some critiques, and then we'll look at some responses to those critiques that we discuss in the paper. So one critique is that compassionate conservationists say that we ought to inject a lot more compassion into conservation, such that conservation is transformed in certain ways by more compassionate attitudes towards particularly sentient individuals, sentient animals. So one criticism has been that traditional conservation, that is not non-compassionate conservation or mainstream conservation, is already compassionate, and that it's kind of quite, in a sense, quite obvious that it is compassionate. For example, one just has to look at what mainstream or traditional conservationists do, and the fact that they take into account animal welfare, for example, when they're doing so. And combined with this criticism is another one that compassionate conservation suffers from a lack of compassion, at least in certain areas. And that in the eyes of some of the critics, it quite obviously lacks compassion, even though it claims to be compassionate. So, for example, it seems that some critics object to the way in which compassionate conservation promotes compassion, but won't necessarily agree with control programs that might kill animals that might be causing other animals to suffer. For example, introduced species that might be causing local animals or native animals to suffer. So therefore, it seems to some of these critics that compassionate conservation suffers from obviously not being as compassionate as it makes itself out to be. So another critique then is that it targets, again, compassion and the notion of compassion, and says that compassion as an effective response, that is a response with an affective dimension or perhaps an emotional dimension, is inappropriate in certain ways, or is problematic in that compassion and other effective responses such as empathy can undermine good decision-making, and can undermine that good decision-making across a broad range of areas. That could be in terms of social policy or legal decision-making, and of course, conservation decision-making as well. So some of these critics think that compassion involves a kind of outpouring of emotion which distorts our ability to make good decisions. For example, by making us more sympathetic towards individuals who are closer to home or more like us, for example, than other individuals, perhaps who are suffering in greater numbers, and that we happen to have less compassion for. So there's some critiques. What are the problems with these critiques? I think, first of all, they raise interesting questions about the nature of compassion, which is certainly worth discussing. After all, compassion is really is a fundamental component of this new movement. So one problem is that it seems to be hard to avoid the conclusion that traditional conservation has tended, as a rule, to overlook animal well-being, and Adam pointed out reasons for that at the start. That is, on many occasions, the welfare of animals has not been significantly taken into account or monitored or regarded in the way that many people now, including animal welfare scientists, would regard as necessary. But I think even more important than that point, or at least as important as that point, is that critics sometimes fail to see that what's at stake here is a substantive moral disagreement about the application of the moral concept of compassion. So one can't undermine the arguments of compassionate conservationists, for example, by pointing out that that traditional conservationists show sympathy to animals, and they can't undermine it simply by pointing out that compassionate conservationists oppose certain forms of lethal control that might improve the animal welfare of other individuals. And the problem is that people can disagree over the meaning of can disagree over how the word or the concept of compassion is applied to specific circumstances. And obviously, well, an easy example perhaps to understand would be that if we take a moral topic from outside of compassion, such as the euthanasia of human beings. Some people think that euthanizing people who are suffering is quite obviously compassionate, whereas others think that it is wrong and not compassionate. In fact, it's unjust or even murder. So here you see a disagreement over the application of the concept of compassion to specific circumstances. And I think something like that is what's going on in this debate. There's also, I think, that sometimes critics put forward a false choice. And that's the choice that they seem to be saying is the choice that we have between merely following our emotions and an outpouring of emotional or affective response, as opposed to disregarding or suppressing our emotions. And I think that's the idea that we either succumb to our emotions or we disregard or suppress them is a false choice. There's another possibility here, and that is that our decision making should be guided by compassion, but by a disciplined form of compassion. That is, we can recognize when compassion has distorted our choices, and when justice is important to apply as well as compassion, and so on. So I think, Adam, if you move on to the next slide there, yep. And we'll move on to the next major area of
time as well, Simon.
Yes. So this is a criticism that sort of comes from the point of view that compassionate conservation is not scientific, or fails to be sufficiently scientific in certain ways. One critique is that compassionate conservationists fail to see the certain bad consequences of actions or of avoiding certain actions like like lethal control programs for introduced species. So the critique is that compassionate conservationists are kind of blind to the bad consequences or severely misjudge the consequences of avoiding certain conservation or traditional conservation actions. Some claim that compassionate conservation is effectively a bad form of science in certain ways, at least, a shoddy science, because some actions, some harmful actions that kill or injure animals are sometimes scientifically necessary. And I guess the most severe criticism of all there is the accusation that compassionate conservationists suffer from a kind of denialism, or are science deniers. So how should we respond to these critiques? Well, one way to do so is to point out that there is always going to be room for disagreement within these discussions about what the science says, about what the facts say, and so on. So there's an area of legitimate disagreement that can be had in this sort of area. But I think much more important than that is that often these criticisms seem to beg the question against the points of view which are being put forward by compassionate conservationists. In particular, they beg the ethical question about the value of animals, the intrinsic value of sentient animals, and our duties to them. And I think that's a serious mistake that sometimes is made. And finally, the accusation that compassionate conservationists are denialists is a strong claim. It basically lumps compassionate conservationists in with climate change deniers, anti-vaxxers, and so forth, and says effectively that they are so far beyond the pale that they can't be scientifically reasoned with. That's a fairly strong claim, and I think that there's reasons to believe that it's false. Adam, I think you can go on to the next slide. And I said earlier that the debate also raises questions for compassionate conservationists themselves, which they could address, I think, for the benefit of the conversation. So one of those areas that we identified is that further discussion could be had about the moral value, the intrinsic moral value of non-sentient individuals. Given the core belief that sentient individuals have moral value, what about non-sentient individuals as well? There's also a question, I think, to be asked about what levels of sentience matter, if they matter at all. That is, do we have stronger obligations to animals which have a higher degree of sentience, versus a lower degree of sentience? For example, do we have stronger obligations to elephants and kangaroos than to tadpoles and crustacea? Another question is that that compassionate conservation has very strong views on the moral value of animals and our duties to them. And this raises the question as to whether we should be intervening in nature in other ways to help animals and to prevent their suffering. For example, what should we do about predation or other natural or human-caused harms that animals can suffer? And finally, I think further debate could be had about the question that occurs when human interests and animal interests come into conflict. For example, if animals are injuring or harming or killing human beings or causing traffic accidents and so forth, at what point can we intervene in ways which might harm those animals? I think that's another ethical question that would be very worthwhile to explore. Adam.
Thanks. And so towards the end of the paper, we sort of identify some ways in which the conversation can maybe continue in a profitable manner. And Simon sort of just highlighted some of the key questions that compassionate conservationists really do need to grapple with to make a strong argument from their perspective of why and how we can include sort of strong consideration of animals in our conservation practice. But from the other side, for critics of compassionate conservation, I think that it's important that we recognise that further debate is worthwhile. There was a reviewer too, when we were putting in this paper, actually suggested that the conversation had been done, and it's no longer worthwhile discussing compassionate conservation. I think that might be a sentiment that is out there, and I think it's the first port of call is to recognise that we do need to continue having these discussions, because animals are important and conservation is having impacts on them. We need to consider that. We need to bring those things together. It's also important that there's a careful, considered and nuanced approach to the arguments that are presented. As we mentioned, many of the arguments, many of the criticisms were dealt with rather simply just by reading the literature, just by reading what compassionate conservationists had said in the past. And there was also some issues with some of the criticism, because they didn't grapple with the complexity or the conceptual complexity around ethics, say. So there was a criticism about we should ignore compassionate conservation because it's just an animal rights position. I mean, there's multiple problems with that criticism. The first being, why would we just ignore an animal rights position? But it also conflated compassionate conservation with animal rights, when compassionate conservationists have explicitly said that they are not a rights-based, they don't take a rights-based approach, and so one of the issues there is that the critics there didn't actually have a deep understanding of what animal rights actually is. It's a specific and particular type of ethical approach to animal ethics. It's a rights-based approach. And if we're going to have a profitable conversation about that, then we should know what we are talking about, basically, in regards to those sorts of things. One of the, I suppose, if I reflect back on the start of the conversation that we've had tonight, or the presentation, I talked about both critics and proponents talking at odds. It's like they're talking over one another. I think one of the main drivers of this is that at the moment, compassionate conservationists are asking us to step back and talk about the values that inform our conservation practice. And the critics are actually, they're starting with the practice, they're starting at the point of the science, where the science is happening, and they're not acknowledging or recognizing or dealing with the values that inform that practice. And those values are anthropocentric, and they minimize animal worth for instance. They don't hold animals as high in regard as compassionate conservationists do. And so for critics to have a profitable conversation with proponents, we need to step back and reflect on the values that are informing our conservation. And then finally, really importantly, is and the point I just made about the criticism of animal rights, of compassionate conservation being animal rights, is that we need to have experts in various fields, including ethics, particularly ethics and philosophy, I think, to help us have these conversations, because they understand those specific discussions and nuances of those discussions far better than, say, a conservationist like myself can. And it's actually one of the papers that criticised compassionate conservation made this point quite, I think, well. At the end, towards the end of their paper, they actually argued that perhaps actually what we need is to bring more people into this conversation who have a wider range of expertise to help us conservationists tackle with the really difficult questions. And that's us. Thanks so much for listening, folks, and love to hear any questions or thoughts or reflections or criticisms that you might have of the presentation and the work.
Thank you very much, Adam. Thanks, Simon, for a really interesting presentation. Is there anybody who would like to go first? You're welcome to unmute yourself and switch your camera on if you have one.
And perhaps Amy can tell us if she's still awake.
I think you've lost her.
I shouldn't have asked that question.
Amy's awake. Great.
Maybe while people get their sort of thoughts organized, how do you see the ultimate aim of this, of incorporating compassionate conservation? Is it simply for practitioners, say, or researchers to have a greater awareness in terms of what they are doing and considering perhaps in more depth kind of harm-benefit analysis of, let's say, management interventions? I mean, certainly if any of us who do animal research wants to do it, it has to do any research, it goes through ethical clearance. But I'm not sure that the similar thing happens in institutions that do the management. Can you perhaps comment on that?
Yeah, I think we can. That's a good point. I'm not sure whether management agencies like government agencies, I would hope that they have ethical protocols, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily what's at stake with the conversation around compassionate conservation. I think compassionate conservationists are really presenting a more radical idea of the future in terms of conservation. It's that the first step shouldn't be, okay, we're going to manage these animals and we'll think about the animal welfare and maybe we'll not kill them as much or whatever. It's actually stepping back and saying, how should we engage with these individuals and these animals as moral beings of individuals that have moral considerability, and what does that mean for conservation? And I think it changes how many of the practices we might currently do in relation to animals or currently commit on animals. It's a far more radical approach, I think. Simon, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think so. I think there are certain things that that both the critics and proponents of compassionate conservation could agree on. For example, that there ought to be certain protocols for before harm is inflicted on animals, or certain conservation measures are undertaken that might have impacts on sentient animals or others, and there could be an area of agreement. For example, there are animal welfare scientists who are interested in conservation, and that do also advocate that more attention should be paid to animal welfare. And that's something that that could be common ground. But I think Adam's also pointed to something pretty important here as well, and that is that that compassionate conservationists are arguing that we reconceive the nature of conservation in various ways, certainly in moral ways, in ethical ways, and that should really start to penetrate into our thinking before we embark on certain conservation programs. That it's really a paradigm shift that they're arguing for, I think. So that's, and Adam said it's a radical position in this. I think certainly in some ways it is. That is, it's a real challenge to conservationists who have practiced in certain ways.
And Amy has a really great question, which is there's recently been a lot of criticism of conservation being unethical towards local communities in the areas where it is being applied. Does compassionate conservation have any insights as to how we should be more ethical towards humans in socio-ecological landscapes? Simon, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it is a great question, Amy. I mean, I think one thing that could be said, certainly compassionate conservations come under some criticism for neglecting human interests. One of those areas could be that certain human beings depend upon wildlife for their survival, say for food, and so there is a difficult disagreement there over what should be done. I think at the same time, it's certainly the case that compassionate conservation, because it is highly motivated by the ethics of our interaction with other beings, would say that we do have very strong obligations to other people. I think that would be rather strange if compassionate conservation said we should only be compassionate towards animals. I think that it's the case that compassionate conservation would say that human beings as well deserve strongest consideration.
And Amy, there's some interesting research being done by compassionate conservationists in this space. For instance, Liv Baker and the I always mispronounce it, but the Manhouts elephant sort of program, where they are rewilding captive elephants into this community that traditionally had lots of elephant, what would it be, domestication sort of for many centuries, and they're trying to establish a new relationship between those communities, being community-led, where those communities help the animals get back out into the wild, live there with their help, because the elephants are sort of still sometimes want or need that human interaction. But yeah, it's this interesting reimagining of how we might do things at those local levels.
Yeah, I think just to pick that up on that briefly, Adam, is that because I don't think I've fully answered Amy's question really. That I think one thing that compassionate conservation does is it's asking us to think more laterally and more creatively about how we manage our ethical relations with others. So that includes other sentient animals, and that includes human beings. So I think it's saying that we ought to be very imaginative in how we accommodate both human and animal interests. But at the same time, I think, as we said in the talk, that it would be certainly worthwhile for them to further explore that and to say, look, particularly for human beings or human groups that depend upon the harming of animals, how should these difficult ethical situations be negotiated?
And just another point to that. I haven't seen it, I haven't had the discussions or seen it written, but I would assume that compassionate conservationists would be against certain types of conservation, like the militarization of conservation, and where there's people who kill poachers, for instance, or hunt poachers. I think that most compassionate conservationists that I know would be against that sort of approach to conservation, because again, it's this do no harm even if those people are harming animals, that doesn't necessarily give us the right to then take their life, for instance. There's other ways that we could be engaging in those issues. Christina's got a really great question that we've been thinking about a lot. So I'm interested if you came across a distinction between animal welfare and animal well-being in your research. Do you want to take that, Simon, or shall I?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Christina. We have been thinking about this. Look, it's not much discussed, I think, in that literature that we focused on, compassion. There is some discussion from animal welfare scientists that compassionate conservationists really need to explain what they mean by animal welfare, what kinds of animals have a welfare, and what the elements of welfare might be. But I mean, it's interesting that you raise the question as to whether the concept of animal welfare and animal well-being are the same or different. And I think this will depend on who you ask. And I think it will, I think it's certainly worth discussing further, because animal welfare science itself can be critiqued, and has been critiqued as often presenting too narrow a view of what animal well-being consists in. But of course, even within animal welfare science, it's a contentious matter as to what welfare actually is.
And yeah, I've been doing some reading into this at the moment, Christina, and it'd be great to chat maybe sometime. But there's, when I read the animal welfare literature, certainly many of them talk about well-being being another part of welfare. So welfare is this overarching umbrella. But when I think about well-being, and when I talk to other people who maybe have a strong commitment to animal ethics around well-being, it's maybe a new way of considering. It's sort of welfare, well-being for the animal. It's taking the, it's rejecting the sort of instrumentalization of animals, which I think is fundamental to animal welfare, or usually not necessarily fundamental, but certainly is present in lots of the animal welfare literature and the animal welfare work that is done. It relies on this instrumentalization of the animals, or it's implicated in the instrumentalization of animals, whereas animal well-being is for sort of taking or considering the animals from their own perspective, what is best for them, for what they would want, what would they need, not for the benefits of humans, but for the benefits of themselves. That's how I consider animal well-being, but I'm certainly, it is really like no one, I don't think, I haven't read anything that really clearly gets into this discussion, but a few of us are having that discussion at the moment. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Love to chat.
Yeah.
I also know that Anne Wilson has got a question. So Anne, you're welcome to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Adam and Simon. I have a question for you, Simon. You, in the earlier part of your talk, you were talking about deontology and utilitarian ethics, and I got the idea that you weren't really in favor of the utilitarian and consequentialist approach in conservation, but I'm actually quite a fan of utilitarian ethics from the viewpoint of that it considers the greatest good for the greatest number. And I think that when we do conservation, we really do need to consider, as it's been raised, communities, stakeholders, the environment, ecosystems, and the individual animal. And I feel that utilitarian ethics through the greatest good, greatest number accommodates that. But I'd like to just hear a little bit more on your why not such a believer in or follower of consequentialism. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for your question. Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting to hear that that we're talking about moral theories in the arena of conservation. So I think that's where it's interesting that the conversation's got to that point. and perhaps that's something that compassionate conservation has done, is to inject these kind of, well, along with others, these kind of moral ideas into the discussion. So I think it's not that I'd be against consequentialism and utilitarianism per se. It's more that the question I wanted to consider was whether or not a compassionate conservationist can be a consequentialist or a utilitarian, and we wanted to suggest that that might be possible. It seems to be that, so some of the compassionate conservationists that have written most on this topic sometimes follow things like virtue ethics rather than consequentialism, and there may be a presumption that compassionate conservationists therefore can't be utilitarians or consequentialists because they have such strong views on harming animals and their principles of do no harm and a peaceful coexistence and so on. But I think it's still to be worked out. And I think whether or not a person can be a compassionate conservationist and a consequentialist or a utilitarian is something that would that we should keep an open mind on. And I agree with you. I mean, it's also not the case that someone who, say, follows deontology or virtue ethics disregards the consequences. That would also be a misreading of virtue theory or deontology. It's not that they don't care about the consequences. It's that they have a different perspective on how to judge right and wrong action. And that perspective might take into account the consequences.
And on that, I think that the most good for the most individuals. I think that the argument needs to be made from the other side as well, from the critic side. That letting out myxomatosis on a rabbit population that wipes out millions and millions of rabbits actually does result in the most good for the most people, or whatever it is. And what is the weighting of collectives versus individuals in these sorts of calculus? And I think it's an open question. I think it's an open question that when we do these mass eradication programs that are continuing and ongoing, whether we are getting the benefit that we are expecting in terms of the calculus of if we just go pure numbers for individuals or days of life or something like that.
And just finally, and also I think it depends on what kind of consequentialist you are. There are different kinds of consequentialists, and consequentialists I need to answer for themselves as to whether to how highly they rate animal interests, for example, against human interests. A utilitarian has a certain way of viewing that, but there can be all sorts of consequentialists as well.
Thanks. There's a question from Cassandra. Cassandra, I don't know if you want to unmute and ask that directly. I think it was in response to what one of you said, because all Cassandra says is, but for the benefit of them, the individual animal. How much is anthropocentric projection? Yeah,
so I can maybe respond to that one. I think that it's interesting that we need to be careful about sort of jumping to the idea of sort of anthropocentric projection straight away off the bat, because we fall into anthropodenialism, where there is no comparable or comparison between humans and animals, and this is sort of like the is another issue that we want to try and avoid. I think that if we look at the science that's been going on alongside conservation in ethology and animal behavior and our understanding of animals now, I think that we can make the claim that animals do have interests that they would prefer, or they do have preferences and these sorts of things. So I think that it's a difficult one to just say, or it's a bit too much to sort of say that it's just anthropocentric projection. I think the science suggests that animals do have interests and those sorts of things that they should be considered.
And then there's a comment from Michael Summers, and I think that was in response to you, Adam, speaking about militarization. And Michael says anti-poaching here in Africa is almost always a last resort after community engagement, education, etc. It's needed to prevent extinction of species, example, rhinos and elephants.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for that point, Michael. I suppose that I just imagine that in the same way that some compassionate conservationists would say that it's never okay to kill another, whether it's human or animal, I think that they would push back against the idea that anti-poaching is ever an acceptable position. It's sort of like some countries not allowing capital punishment, that we do not kill people even if they have committed the most heinous of crimes. There's a significant, it oversteps a particular moral boundary that we don't want to go past. And it also,
sorry, Adam.
I was going to say,
go, Adam.
You go.
No, Michael. I mean, Michael, is a really interesting question. I suppose it depends on what anti-poaching actually means there. But if certainly might be, there's a difference, I guess, between shooting a poacher in self-defense and shooting them as a deterrent to stop other poachers. And it may be that that most compassionate conservationists who have strong views on the need to treat other individuals with compassion, that includes humans, might say that that shooting people as a deterrent is wrong. But of course, we did point to the fact that there can be disagreements amongst compassionate conservationists as to when lethal force and other forms of harm are justified in various circumstances.
Thank you. Is there anybody with one last burning question that you'd like to fire off? Because I don't see any more. There's one from Amy in the chat. Many research methods such as GPS collaring can be invasive and risk the welfare of individual animals, but in theory contribute towards conservation of the entire species. Is there a framework for evaluating whether the ends justify the means in these cases?
That's a great question, and I think this is probably where the conversation is currently at. So we're doing some work with compassionate conservationists around what is acceptable practice. In what circumstances might you accept collaring, or might you accept translocation, or might you accept some other form, fencing, some other form of intervention? Is it always, is it never, is it somewhere in between? Does it depend? I think these questions are really open at the moment within the community, and it's a really good one to ask. I've got a personal position, I suppose, but I think every individual in the community would have a different, probably a different position on that one. And it's sort of also, like for me, it's always contributes towards conservation of the entire species. Is often what we say as conservationists and scientists, and sometimes the reality is not. It's not actually the case. It's what we hope for, it's what we work for, and it's what we really want to have happen. But conservation's a hard game, and we fail at it a lot, and a lot of the things that we do to animals occur in that context.
Yeah, and I think just to quickly finish up, that a framework like compassionate conservation has at least raised this question that that if we hold animals, sentient animals, as well as non-sentient animals in the environment to be morally important, to deserve our respect and protection, then a whole lot of difficult ethical dilemmas are going to be created. If you simply say that sentient animals have no value whatsoever and it doesn't matter how we treat them, then things look a lot easier in one respect. But I think Amy's question there shows how difficult these sorts of questions can be in the real world, and that there might be kinds of frameworks for evaluating them, as you say in your question, and that could really help guide us. But it's difficult because people are going to disagree over the frameworks, and they're going to disagree on how those frameworks should be applied. I think that's really what makes this area both really difficult and hard, but also really interesting.
And on that, I just remembered a recent conversation with a proponent who suggested that, you know, if we take an approach that is respectful and in the best interests of the animals, then yes. But then, as you say, it's about how do we determine what is the best interest, and I think that's the ongoing. That's a really big question, really interesting one, and maybe we can have conversations as well, Amy. Get in touch. Love to chat to you about it.
Okay, there's one more burning question. Anne, back to you.
Thank you. I'm a big animal welfare, compassion, in favor of such ideologies, but I question putting the word compassion in the front of conservation as opposed to in the descriptor. I feel almost by putting it in front, we are splitting conservationists up. And what I would maybe like to see more is that we rather include it in the definition of what conservation is, as opposed to having just a specific type of conservationist. I would rather like to see conservation as someone who is compassionate, who considers animal welfare legislation. And I would like to see maybe in curricula, in nature conservation curricula, that is taught, that we start not just teaching about, you know, legislation around biodiversity and stuff, but we include legislation around animal welfare, and we bring in ideas about unnecessary suffering, and we bring in ideas about how you treat the individual when you manage the greater number. I think that would be yes, it's just a comment that I think we would achieve more by bringing it into our way of thinking about conservation, as opposed to just singling out certain conservationists as being those that are compassionate and those that are not. Because I think the days of not having compassion are not really an option. And we don't necessarily have to put that specific virtue in the front of the title, because there's many virtues we could have put in front of the title, and it should rather become a part of what modern society thinks conservation should be. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. And I think compassionate conservationists could probably agree with that, in the sense that if compassionate, if the kind of compassion that they believe in was to percolate through compassion, through conservation practice, then they may well think that dropping the word compassion from the title conservation would be an acceptable move.
Thank you. Okay, I think we do need to wrap things up. So Adam, Simon, thank you very much for a really interesting seminar. There's lots of food for thought in there. And thank you also to the audience for the interesting questions and contributions and the general discussion. Lastly, I would just like to remind you to please visit the SEB Emerging Issues in Conservation webpage, where we have a schedule of upcoming talks throughout August and September. There's still a couple that needs to be confirmed for September, but there's a list of interesting talks already there. And then lastly, just to remind you of next week's seminar in exactly the same time slot, 8 GMT, by Jorge de Menezes, on deforestation, fires, and lack of governance are displacing thousands of jaguars in the Brazilian Amazon. And that paper is currently in early view in conservation science and practice. And with that, thanks again, everybody, and goodbye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.